Okay, so this is a compulsory liquidation. It's a story about a compulsory liquidation. I could have called it very, very complicated without not inconsiderable risk for the IP Limited, but that's a bit of a mouthful. So I thought I'd just refer to it as the company, and that's what we'll do. So the outline of the company were these were the basic facts. The company dealt in scrap cars, lots of scrap cars on site, and the company traded alongside a sole trade of one of the directors. And by that, I mean the two businesses, that is the sole trader and the limited company, each owned separate pieces of land alongside each other from which they traded. Not jointly but separate, about 40% owned by the company and around 60% owned by the sole trade. And the total site was around 20 acres. There was significant bank borrowing by the company which was secured. And there were 4 directors. There was Chris, who was also the proprietor of the sole trade, his wife Bev, their son Arnold, and Bob, an outside investor. And around 18 months ago, I had a call from Bob, who'd been a client of Griffin & King when we were a general practice. And he knew that we now specialised in insolvency. And Bob told me that he'd invested around £150,000 into the company about 5 years ago, and he also became a director at the same time. And Bob's a wealthy businessman with quite a few business interests, so he'd left the family directors to manage the business. And Bob went on to explain. The trade had declined for numerous reasons. The directors had failed to move with the times. Chris, who was well into his 70s, was suffering with illness issues and not able to cope. Bev hadn't really got a clue. Arnold wasn't able to step up. The accounting records weren't maintained, and yes, we've heard it all before, haven't we? And Chris was made bankrupt around 6 months before, and his estate was being dealt with by the official receiver. An HMRC had issued a winding up petition against the company, and a winding up order had been made by the court around 14 days ago. The official receiver had spoken to Bob as the major creditor and asked if he'd had any preference as to the IP, that's the Insolvency Practitioner, which IP should be appointed, and he proposed us. And Bob explained to me that the official receiver had also spoken to HMRC, who had no objection to us being appointed either. But he didn't really know anything more. So I called the official receiver straight away, and he told me everything he knew, which didn't take very long at all. And what most people don't know about the official receiver is that they just want to get cases off their desks as quickly as possible. They often don't know all the details and are inclined to miss the odd bank charge or value of it, and without putting too fine a point on it, that can be quite important. And it took the official receiver about 10 minutes to explain everything he knew to me. And this is what he told me. There were around 10 employees. He didn't know what was happening with the trade. Chris and Arnold were ignoring the fact that a winding up order had been made and nothing had happened since the date of the order. So the employees were continuing to run the business. And the land, this 20-acre site, could be split into 3 distinct areas. And here's a slide to illustrate the position. Part belonged to Chris personally, that's around 60%, which would be dealt with by Chris's trustee. Part belonged to the company, but subject to a bank charge, that's around 30%. And part was unencumbered and belonged to the company, around 10%. So going back to what the official receiver was telling me, he wasn't sure what the valuation of the property was. He wasn't sure the level of the bank borrowing that was secured on the property. He told me that there were a number of tenants on site that had separate buildings and were conducting independent trades. and there weren't any formal agreements with those tenants. And there were lots of scrap vehicles belonging to the company that were all over the site, some in buildings, some in the open. And because the site couldn't be closed off, particularly because of the tenant's right, there were significant security issues on that site. And also, because of the usage of the site, there were issues of contamination. And the bank were considering appointing a receiver. And steps were being taken to appoint me as liquidator, providing I accepted the appointment, and the official receiver wanted a decision that day as there were so many pressing issues. So, no pressure there. I had to make a very quick decision based on the information that I had as to whether I accepted the appointment. And that's where the life of an IP can be very risky. It would probably be at least a couple of weeks before I had a good understanding of all the details. Just bear with me. So why was it all so important to me? As you may know, the way any liquidation works is that a liquidator will only get paid from the realisation of the assets, which would be after any costs. And in the case of a compulsory liquidation, that would mean all the official receiver's costs and petitioning creditor costs, plus any expenses of the liquidation, would have to be paid before I'd have any chance of recovering my fees from the realisations. And that means that if there are insufficient realisations, not only would it mean my staff and I were working for nothing, but I could also end up personally liable for certain expenses incurred in the liquidation. And from what I could see, there was an unencumbered piece of land belonging to the company, but I hadn't really got a clue of the valuation, let alone whether anybody might be interested in buying it. And I guessed the valuation to be somewhere between £25,000 and £100,000, but subject to the contamination, which could even render it worthless. And believe me, not an easy decision, but I crossed my fingers and confirmed that the official receiver I was prepared to act as liquidator. And just before I continue the story, I'll just explain what the difference is between a compulsory liquidation and the difference between a creditor's voluntary liquidation. That's a CVL and a compulsory liquidation. So a CVL that's a creditor's voluntary liquidation, is a directors driven process. The board resolve the company cannot continue to trade by reason of its liabilities, and a meeting of creditors is called. And from the date of the directors' meeting to the date of the creditors' meeting, which is the date when the company enters liquidation and the liquidator is appointed, is around 16 to 28 days, depending upon the articles of the company. The court and the official receiver are not involved in this process at all. And a compulsory liquidation is a court-driven process which can be initiated or petitioned by a number of parties. That is, a creditor, as it has been in this particular case, or a member, that's a shareholder, or an administrator or a supervisor of a company voluntary arrangement, a CVA. And typically the timescale for a compulsory liquidation is much longer than it would be for a creditor's voluntary liquidation. And assuming a creditor issues a winding up petition against a company, it's likely to be around 6 to 7 weeks before it's listed to be heard by the court. And at the hearing, the court will issue a winding up petition, a winding up order, unless there are good grounds not to make the order. And once the order has been made, the process is taken over by the official receiver, and if there appears to be assets belonging to the company, the official receiver will look to have an independent insolvency practitioner appointed to deal with the case. And he can do this either through what's called the rota, which is a list of local IPs that are prepared to take these appointments, or he can make an appointment following direct consultation with the major creditors, which of course is what he did in this instance, or we could be appointed by a formal creditors meeting, but that would take at least another 3 to 4 weeks to convene. So, back to the story. And if you recall, I just made the decision to take my life into my own hands and take the appointment. And because of the urgent issues raised by the official receiver, I had no choice but to clear my diary and drive immediately to the site, which is about 2 hours away in deepest Herefordshire. And there were things that needed to be dealt with straight away. So I had to dismiss the staff that day and make sure we had contact details to ensure that we could process their entitlements. I had to secure the books and records and agree with the bookkeeper whether she would stay on to bring the records up to date as soon as possible. I needed to secure the office and the site, and as a temporary measure, had to instruct an agent to have 24-hour patrols on the site as we couldn't render it secure. And I needed to collect any cash and other valuables that were on site. And I managed to get away eventually at around 11 o'clock that night, an event that evening, but at least I'd managed to do what I wanted to do. And as things worked out, the bookkeeper was very helpful, and we kept her on for a couple of weeks. We went back on site quite a few times over the next few weeks, sorting out the most pressing problems. And particularly, the biggest problem was with the tenants. And the tenants on site had their electricity supplied from one substation, which was located, would you believe it, on the unencumbered part of the property belonging to the company and therefore my responsibility. And historically, this was being recharged on a monthly basis. But there was no way that the actual usage of the tenants could be monitored, and unbelievably, this had been historically charged by the directors on an estimated basis. And the electricity supply company were owed around about £40,000 by the company, and were threatened to cut off the supplies if I didn't sign a personal guarantee to cover electrical supplies from the date of my appointment. And they wanted this done immediately. And based on what we could see, the amounts recharged to the various tenants per month was coming into loss per month of around £10,000. So I had to make a difficult decision. Should I let the power be cut off and risk potential court action from the tenants? Or explain my position to the tenants, request a deposit to be made against the electricity charges and increase the charges, all based on estimated information. Not easy, but that's how we proceeded. And as you can imagine, we got a mixed reaction from the tenants, and it was far from perfect as far as I was concerned. But ultimately, they knew they had to work with me or face not having a power supply. So I reluctantly signed the personal guarantee, but didn't get that much sleep that night either. The water charges were similar, albeit the amounts weren't so much, so that wasn't quite such a problem. Security remained a massive issue. We couldn't just lock the gates because of the tenants, so we had to arrange a permanent 24-hour security presence for the whole site at a huge cost. And despite the help of the bookkeeper, the accounting records were a complete shambles. We needed to make some sense of the records, to investigate what had been happening and who the creditors were. And then there was the environmental licence. And the company had this because of the scrap trade. It carried on. We didn't really know what to do with this at all, so we sought legal advice. And one solicitor advised us to disclaim it, another to retain it, and both warned of serious potential problems for me if we got it wrong. A week or so after we were appointed, the bank appointed a receiver to recover the bank's interest. And just to break from the story for a few minutes, talk about receivers. So a bank will appoint a receiver when there's been a breach of loan conditions on a mortgage, typically for non-payment. And the company doesn't have to be in liquidation or any insolvency process, so the bank can take this action without reference to any other creditors or to the directors, in fact. And what's the difference between an LPA receiver and a fixed charge receiver? An LPA receiver is appointed under the Law of Property Act 1925, and the lender, that's typically the bank, becomes eligible to appoint when the lender can exercise his power of sale, such as on a mortgage default. And under the LPA 1925, an LPA receiver has the power to demand and recover all income, that's typically the rent, but not a sale. So the powers within the Act are relatively limited. But the powers of an LPA receiver are often supplemented by additional powers included in the legal charge, such as the sale. The fixed charge receiver is appointed directly under the terms of the mortgage deed. There's no reference to a court. This is far more flexible as far as the lender is concerned to appoint under a fixed charge rather than the LPA. And most of the receivers we come across are in fact fixed charge receivers. So, back to the story. And just to recap, we've got this 20-acre site with myself as liquidator, the trustee, and now a receiver in possession of another part, which was charged to the bank. So we called a meeting between myself, the receiver, and the trustee to agree how the common issues could be dealt with, and particularly the security issues on site and the sharing of costs, and the appointment of a marketing agent for the trustee, liquidator, and receiver to sell the land. We proceeded to jointly instruct a property agent who gave us the first real indication of the value of the property. And that was approximately £500,000 to the trustee, £400,000 to the receiver, and £75,000 to ourselves, a total of around £1 million. And one of the tenants was actually interested in buying the site, and the agent took up negotiations with him, who made an offer of £950,000 for the full site. This was slightly lower than we'd hoped for, but particularly bear in mind the contamination issue, at least it was a reasonable offer and a big relief to me. The agent called another meeting with the trustee, the receiver, and myself. We agreed we'd have full marketing for a relatively short period of about 4 to 6 weeks to see if there was any other interest, and at the same time hoping we didn't upset the tenant. So the agent got on with it, and within a couple of weeks the agent identified a further 8 parties, interested parties, and the 2 highest bidding parties were invited to submit their best and final offers. And both parties offered around 1.1 million. So a very worthwhile exercise, but difficult to distinguish the best offer. And we agreed the fairest way to deal with this was that the first potential purchaser to complete the contract would be the winner, a contract race. So draft composite contracts were issued to both parties and the race was on. Oh. Thanks, Janet. Hope nobody was of a sensitive disposition. Right, so the race was on. I've never seen anything so complicated. There was 1 sales contract, 3 sellers, 2 alternative buyers, and to complicate matters, the trustee, the receiver, and myself all needed to have separate solicitors acting for us because we all had slightly different issues and interests to deal with. And once the race started, I was inundated with calls and emails from my solicitors and the other 2 joint vendors. It was important, of course, that we all worked together for the common good. Well, and apologies to any solicitors who are in the room now, and I know there's a few, but I've never seen solicitors work so fast. And within a few days, we had completion. Few, I thought. And within a few days of completion, I was mighty relieved to receive from the solicitors the liquidator's share of the proceeds. But before we could pay the costs of the liquidation, these funds had to be banked in the Bank of England, where a 15% Secretary of State fee is applied to all receipts. And effectively, it's a tax. So that's the exciting bit. I thought so anyway. So what happened next? Well, we found out after much inquiry that the bank debt secured under the charge was around £200,000. And once the receiver paid the bank back, his job had come to an end. And as you'll remember, the land with the bank charge on actually belonged to the company, and the liquidator received the proceeds after the receiver had paid his fees and the other expenses, a sum of around £250,000. And so we'd now recovered a substantial amount of over £350,000, and it was clear that we should be in a position to pay all of the creditors. And that was easier said than done, given the state of the records. But we did our best to work with the creditors and work out their debt. And all creditors were paid back 100% of their debt, which I don't think was a bad result, even though I say so myself. And Bob actually called me when he got his cheque. I never thought I'd get my money back, he said. And to say he was pleased was a bit of an understatement, believe me. Okay, so what happened to Chris, Bev and Arnold, eh? The last I heard, Chris was trying to sue the trustee, and Arnold had complained that I'd pocketed the cash, the petty cash on the site that first day I'd turned up. Just for the avoidance of doubt, I'd like to make it put on the record and make it absolutely clear that I didn't actually pocket the cash. So is there a moral to the story? Well, if Chris, Bev and Arnold had sought advice when the warning sign started, things could have worked out so differently, and they may still have their business, or at least a value for it. And what are the warning signs? Those are the signs that people who run companies and advisors to businesses should be aware of. Things like cheques bouncing, overdrafts operating at the limit or going above the limit on a regular basis, not paying suppliers on time, arrears of PAYE and VAT, that sort of thing. But could things really have been different for Chris and Bev and Arnold? Well, I'd say so. If only they'd taken advice instead of burying their heads. The fact that the creditors were paid in full meant that the value of the assets exceeded the liabilities. Even if the business was incurring losses, which it almost certainly was, it would have been quite possible to have a solvent liquidation or another procedure where Chris, Bev and Arnold minimised professional fees and maximised the return they would get. And instead, they received nothing for the business, and the professional fees and costs came to at least £350,000. Not all mine, I hasten to add. So, what have we covered in today's talk? We've looked at the difference between a Creditors Voluntary Liquidation and a Compulsory Liquidation. We've looked at the circumstances a receiver is appointed and the differences between an LPA receiver and a fixed charge receiver. And we've looked at some of the practical issues that a liquidator deals with when he's doing his job and the risks he has to take. And we've seen how the creditors on this case have been fully paid and the difference it's made to Bob, and how it's so important for directors to seek advice as soon as they see any financial warning signs. Insolvency is an area that most professionals don't deal with on a regular basis. It's so important to know who you can contact and get some specialist advice at the right time and plan together. So what do I want you to do? Well, have a think. Do you know a Bob out there? Or do you know a Chris or a Bev or an Arnold that are putting their head in the sand? Do you know anyone like this whose issues like we've looked at today, or you think we might be able to help? If you do, please speak to me or one of my colleagues. We're always pleased to have a chat or a meeting without charge to explore options, and I'm sure we can help. What we're trying to avoid is a formal insolvency situation, but the next best thing is a structured, planned insolvency process of which the director or the individual can retain a good element of control. Okay, and just before I conclude, I'd like to ask my colleagues at Griffin & King just to stand up and make themselves known. And okay, thank you everybody. Thank you very much, and thank you, Blakey. Thank you very much.